This is Karsi Palace, the seat of Sultai power as it appeared in Khans of Tarkir. And this is Karsi Palace as it appears in Tarkir Dragonstorm, 5 years and one timeline shift later. This, as the Sid Meier's Civilization players among you will recognize, is Angkor Wat, a 900-year-old temple in what was once the capital of the Khmer Empire, today known as Cambodia. And finally, this is the Moonlight Pavilion of the Royal Palace of Cambodia, built a mere 111 years ago. These similarities are not coincidence, and they aren't terribly surprising, because back in 2014, Wizards explicitly told us that the Sultai are primarily based on Cambodia and the preceding Khmer Empire, which at its height included much of Thailand, Laos, parts of Vietnam. While these two views of Karsi Palace provide the clearest direct contrast between the old Sultai of the original Tarkir block and the newly freed Sultai of Tarkir Dragonstorm, there's a lot more we can see by looking at the buildings, the architecture of the Sultai, both in-universe, in terms of how a people are rebuilding their society after over a millennia of rule by a sadistic dragon lord, and from our perspective as viewers, how the artists and Wizards creative team drew on an expanded set of real-world influences from Southeast Asia in bringing this set to life. In order to appreciate the new Sultai, let's get a better sense of who they were in the beginning. They were first introduced along with the other 4 clans in Khans of Tarkir 2014. Now that was 5 years ago from the perspective of characters in Magic's multiverse, and it was in a different timeline where the Dragon Lords never existed. This version of the Sultai Brood is also an oppressive regime, but instead of dragons, it was a ruling class of Naga and allied Rakshasa who did the actual oppressing. There are about a dozen cards in the set that provide a good view of Sultai buildings, but let's start with the Sultai basic lands. And immediately, the Angkorian influence is very strong. The big distinguishing feature here, where we'll really see a contrast once we get to Tarkir Dragonstorm, is that everything has square edges. I'm not talking about ornamentation, but the structural elements. You don't see round towers, you don't see domes. In these, both the forest and the swamp, that's pretty straightforward. But then, let's take a look at the island. If you look at the base of these structures, you do see all square edges, but the way the light hits the main tower, the overall structure, it could be square, it could be rounded, and the tops of these smaller spires off to the side seem to have a bit of a smooth curve. But let's look again at the spires of Angkor Wat. It's a similar effect. They seem conical. But if you get a closer look, you'll find that's an optical illusion. Both horizontally and vertically, the actual structure, again, not the ornamentation, is all square edges. The spire is made of a series of tiers or terraces that decrease in width as they go up, but not evenly, slowly at first and then more rapidly near the top, so that if you trace a line against the outside edge, it makes a curve. Here's an example of an older temple, Preah Ko, with fewer tiers and less ornamentation, so you can really see how that optical effect plays out. This image also demonstrates the rounding effect of weathering, particularly in this tower on the left. Finally, the Angkorian style does have a lot of ornamentation and small statuary, which can smooth out the profile of the overall structure. And I can't find any good photos of Angkor Wat's spires in which there's enough detail, but this is the Prasat Hin Pamai temple. Same time period, same style. Now compare that to the island, and I think the influence is very clear. Let's also look at a few non-land cards that are focused on characters but have clear architectural features in the background. Necropolis Fiend features this steeply stepped pyramid with a shrine atop standing alone, and there seems to be another one in the background. And to me, this initially invokes more of a Mesoamerican feeling, like this would be at home in Ixalan. But it's basically this type of structure. This is another view of one of the spires of Angkor Wat. Just picture that if it weren't part of a larger building complex. The snakeheads on Necropolis Fiend may seem like a fanciful addition, but this Naga has a few more heads. But it's a Naga at Angkor Wat. And this is where the concept of Naga come from. Hinduism and Buddhism, the two dominant religions in this region. And it's not entirely obvious from this angle, but this Naga statue anchors the end of that railing. We'll see more of that in a bit. Speaking of Naga, the stairways we see behind Sidisi and the suspended walkways in the back of Sultai Ascendancy are unlike anything we see in reality from the Khmer Empire. But the square, angular, edged aesthetic persists. And we have the first appearance of another interesting element. In both these pieces, we see characters wielding what I guess we're calling a palm axe or a fan axe. As far as I can tell, that seems to be a weapon invented by the production crew of The Mummy Returns, the 2001 Brendan Fraser movie, based on a fanciful interpretation of this wall from the Temple of Hatshepsut, which probably actually depicts fan bearers. To be fair, this weapon does also resemble a monk's spade, which is associated with Shaolin monks, so maybe these would be more appropriately a Jeskai weapon. But the reason I've gone off on this particular tangent in a video about architecture, look more closely at the wall behind Sidisi. We're going to see this shape, which bears a striking resemblance to this weapon in a lot of places. Now, I don't want to totally lose momentum on the main architectural topic, so I'm going to set this aside and come back to it at the end of the video. But until then, you can play a fun minigame of Spot That Shape and see how many you can catch before we come back to it. So, one more card from Cons, and maybe the most famous, Treasure Cruise. We're looking at this one because I want to acknowledge the weakest case for my thesis, which I should probably state explicitly, that the architecture of the Sultai of Khans of Tarkir is based solely on the classic Khmer Empire style as exemplified by Angkor Wat. This tower in the background gives the impression of a rounded cylindrical main structure topped by a rounded dome. If you look very closely at the dome, though, there are these dark rings implying tiers, so it's plausibly this same illusory dome phenomenon again. On the body of the tower, we see vertical sections that reflect light in the same way, rather than a gradient shading, implying that it's not a cylinder, but more of perhaps an octagon. Not all right angles, like everything else we've seen, but still not truly curved. This structure also has sort of a lighthouse feeling to it. It's positioned on the edge of the water, with light emanating from the top. And in all the Khmer temples that we've looked at, there are no windows in the spires, no light shining out, but I think we can reasonably conclude that this shares the same influences as the other pieces and just takes a bit more creative liberty. Then let's move on to Fate Reforged. It was the set after Khans, but in the story it takes us 1,280 years into the past, to a time when the clans were in the process of being overwhelmed by dragons. Now, being a small set, there were only 10 basic lands, so each clan only got 2. There's no island for the Sultai, but how cool are these? We can see the same locations as the Khans' land. This really illustrates a contrast, showing that while the Khans of Tarkir structures weren't necessarily completely abandoned, they had diminished considerably over time. For the forest in particular, let's take another look at Prea Ko and admire how Adam Paquette, who did all the Sultai basic lands across Tarkir block, shows what a millennia of exposure to the elements will do to these structures. I'm really focused on the way the clear tiers have given way to more of a rounded surface, or at least a simple triangle in this further elevated pyramid. And we see a similar, if less pronounced effect at the tops of these two smaller structures on the sides of the swamp. Now, being a small set, and having to split the card file with the Dragon's theme, there's only one non-land card in Fate Reforged that gives us a good exterior view of a Sultai building. Palace Siege. Here, unlike throughout Khans, we have a clear cylindrical tower topped with a dome, and then another dome here in the lower right. Now, it could be that I'm reading too much into this. It's possible the artist just wasn't given the same style guide as in Khans or was just taking liberties, but as consistent as everything in Khans was, this strikes me as intentional. Like, this establishes that a smoother, rounder building style existed in the past, and perhaps the Naga or the Rakshasa, who were firmly in charge of the Sultai brood in the old Khans timeline, steered toward that angular style over time. So, we move to the final set of the original block, Dragons of Tarkir. We're back at the same point in time as Khans, but an altered timeline. The Sultai no longer exist by that name, but were conquered by the Dragon Lord Silumgar and have been subjugated by him for over a millennia. And look at that. Domes. Now, truthfully, this isn't a major trend. It's just an element that shows up in a few places in the current timeline. But another place we do see a dome is on the Wandering Tomb Shell. And the tomb shell features another element that we're going to see a lot of from here on out, and that is truly decayed, abandoned structures. Not merely buildings that have seen better days, like on the Khans of Tarkir basic lands, but clearly uninhabited ruins. And on that note, let's have a look at the basic lands from Dragons of Tarkir and see how Adam Paquette has updated things for this setting. No forest this time, because in the transition from independent clans to vassals of the Dragon Lords, the clans each lost a color, so the brood under Silumgar are just blue-black. And now, the swamp is basically unrecognizable. If Wizards hadn't already established the pattern that the basics in the block would be depicting the same locations, I would never have made the connection. And again, the same amount of time has passed from the events of Fate Reforged to both of these. The Khans basic shows some serious wear and tear, but in the Dragon's timeline, this wall has completely collapsed. This tower is hardly recognizable as a purposefully built structure, and this is more general world building than architecture, but there's hardly any plant life. The trees are still standing, but it seems like this once thriving ecosystem is on its last legs. Here on the island, the decay isn't as apparent, but that's largely because we're at a very different vantage point. I think the new perspective is from about here. And we don't have a pristine version from Fate Reforged to compare to. It is satisfying, though, to be able to verify, given this closer perspective, that these towers are, in fact, composed of all right angles. Then there's the Deathbringer Regent. At first, I thought this depicted an attack on the Jeskai with all these waterfalls. But the island we just looked at helps tie that sort of geography in with the Sultai, and now Silumgar territory. And just look at that architecture. Square angles, tiers, rich ornamentation, really back to that Angkorian style. And here, in the Shambling Goblin, we see more Angkorian style, and we see things in such a state of disrepair that some of the towers are leaning to the side. And finally, an additional influence that I'd almost missed. Look at the Palace Familiar. Unlike a lot of the cards we've looked at from this set, here we have a place that's clearly inhabited and in use. And look at the tower on the upper right. It's unlike any of the other architecture we've seen. Also, here on the left, between the human and the owl, it seems to be a similar structure closer up. And we see these smooth, round, ringed spires. Looks a lot like this. This is Wat Prasi Sanpet. Or rather, these three stupas, which are burial mounds similar to mausoleums or reliquaries, are the only surviving structures from that temple. They were built a few centuries after Angkor Wat, between 1492 and 1529, and 250 miles away, deep in present-day Thailand. By the time these were built, the Khmer Empire had fallen and been supplanted by the kingdom of Ayutthaya as the dominant power in the region. This temple was in their capital city, and each of these stupas was built to hold the ashes of a particular king. That's everything I wanted to look at from original Tarkir block. Before we dive into Tarkir Dragonstorm, let's take a quick stock of what we've seen. In the Khans timeline, it was classical Khmer architecture. Angkor Wat all the way, all the time. In the current timeline, that's still the dominant influence, but we start pulling in a few more diverse elements, and we're seeing more extreme disrepair and decay of buildings from the distant past. That finally brings us to Tarkir Dragonstorm. 10 years later for us, 5 years later for the occupants of this world, and only 2 years after the Dragon Lords were overthrown. And finally, we see something I didn't even realize had been absent until I started working on this video. Throughout the original Tarkir block, across both timelines, the types of buildings we saw were exclusively temples, palaces, great works, the places where wealth and power was concentrated among the ruling class, the oppressors of Sultai society. Now, while many of these structures are still represented in the art, the focus is on the people, the places where the actual people who make up the Sultai live and work, celebrate, create and perform art. Let's take a closer look, then, at the standard art for Kishla Village. Look how Bruce Bernays has used this shaft of sunlight to really direct our focus. Yeah, the old temples are still there, but our focus, in this art and throughout the set really, is on the common people. There's an alternate art for Kishla Village itself, and beyond that, we see this village specifically depicted in multiple other cards: Kishla Skimmer, Dragon's Prey. Then we also have Dismal Backwater, which could be another view of Kishla, but seems to have sufficiently different geography to be an entirely separate place. Either way, all the buildings depicted have a couple of unifying elements. And the first one is shared with the New Karsi Palace, and that's the roof. Triangular, tiled, and usually with 2 or more symmetrical tiers. Like I mentioned back in the intro, this style of roof matches pretty well what we see in the Cambodian royal palace, but the oldest of those structures are from the 1850s, much more recent than anything else we've looked at thus far. If this style had only sprung into existence then, it wouldn't be a problem, because this is a magic set, not a documentary. And I think this is a cool homage to real-world culture. Structures of this type tend to be made of wood and other materials that don't last for hundreds and hundreds of years. But it so happens that the Khmer Empire temples, the Bayon in particular, are incredibly rich sources of bas-relief depictions of all sorts of things, including domestic life at the time. The Bayon was built just 50 to 100 years after Angkor Wat, and provides clear evidence that this type of roofing actually was completely contemporary with the rest of the Khmer Empire influences we've examined thus far. The other unifying element that we see across all this new architecture, except for Karsi Palace, is that everything is built on stilts over the water. Now, building on stilts is a construction technique that's part of many cultures that build right on the water or just deal with regular flooding. A major river, the Mekong, flows right through Cambodia, and it floods annually, every monsoon season. If you go on Google Street View right now and just look along the Mekong River, you'll see plenty of houses built on stilts. Most incorporate more modern building materials. You're not likely to find one as appropriate to this conversation as this one. This is from the Wiki Commons. It's a petit Khmer house, meaning that it's got more traditional elements, like that familiar roof tiling. And then this is from a location called the Cambodian Cultural Village, which was constructed a couple of decades ago as more of a museum piece to showcase older building styles. And this image from the banks of Tonle Sap, the Great Lake of Cambodia, which is quite near to Angkor, is just a picture of an actual community from a little over 10 years ago. So I absolutely love the way artists have taken these real-world influences from the same region as the Angkorian style that everything was centered on until now, and built out the world of the Sultai this way. Of course, they've added their own spin to things. Elena Donner's ironically titled Dismal Backwater has an almost Rivendell quality with all the swoops and curves she's added. And a lot of them have these sort of watchtowers in a style that seems to be a fusion of the traditional Khmer housing style with elements from European castles, which is sort of to say a general Western fantasy style. Seems like an interesting coincidence that these towers are appearing in multiple pieces, Well, Wizards allowed Leon Tucker to share some of the concept art that he did early in the creative process for Tarkir Dragonstorm. And here we can see the clear prototype for so much of what we've been looking at, including those watchtowers. But now that we're looking at these images, let's turn our attention back to the towers and spires that we see in the background of so many of these cards. Their most apparent feature in the standard art for Kishla Village, and even more so in Dragon's Prey, is that a lot of them are in really dire condition. Not only do these specimens look like they've been neglected for centuries, they're leaning so far that they must be held up by the trees. I mean, surely they would topple under their own weight at this angle. Not so with those in the background of Carsey Palace, which I think tells us something about the reign of Silumgar. Carsey Palace and Keru City, in which it's located, are the seat of power, and that seems like what you'd expect from a corrupt regime, to say nothing of an explicitly evil overlord. That's where the wealth is concentrated, and that's where the nice things are maintained. To be part of the larger empire, like Kishla Village, they were probably allowed to exist as long as they served the desires of Silumgar and the ruling class, but they absolutely were not getting the resources sent back to them to maintain things. But beyond the state of the spires in these pieces, look at how many there are, and the immense variety we see in their structure. In Dragons of Tarkir, again, only 5 years ago in universe, we only saw a handful of cases, like on Wandering Tombshell and Palace Familiar, that expanded beyond the Angkorian style. But here, we see an absolute flourishing of variety. Nearly every structure seems stylistically unique. I think that has really interesting world-building implications. They were probably built at very different times for different purposes. It suggests that these places have a real complex history. And I think it poses interesting questions. Like, how did this creativity manage to exist and be expressed under Silumgar's reign? And while I don't have any good leads on that, I do have some ideas about the influences Wizards' creative team drew on here. This is Wat Pra Keo in Bangkok, Thailand. Construction started in the late 1700s. There are certainly some repeating elements here, but the variety is striking. Here's another perspective of the same temple that really emphasizes the wide range of styles present in this complex. Now, there is a whole world of history behind the different building types and styles here, and I started to research them, but it quickly became apparent that it is way beyond my capacity or the scope of this type of video to get further into. And I also think it ends up being sort of unnecessary. Because what I perceive when looking at Corroding Dragonstorm, for example, is the artists starting with an expanded range of real-world influences, like this temple, but then continuing to just merge ideas and explore creatively from there. And that doesn't result in quite as clean an homage to real-world culture and design as we saw in original Tarkir block, but it also doesn't cease to be that homage, and I can't deny that the result is evocative and cool. But let's come back to the Carsey Palace and consider another element of this art that is a much more straightforward reference to a real-world design element. Earlier, we briefly looked at this feature from Angkor Wat, and what I didn't get into then is that there's a rich tradition of railings, primarily on stairs and bridges, being the body of a snake or naga, whose head is represented as a statue at the end. This is a Naga bridge. It shows up at various Khmer Empire archaeological sites, but it's also just a pervasive element through a lot of Southeast Asian architecture. I mean, look at this stairway at the Pura Parayangan Hindu temple in Indonesia. You can clearly make out the scaled texture on the railing. Now, have another look at the new Carsey Palace, and direct your attention to the railings surrounding the courtyard. We also see that in more detail on 100 Battle Veteran and Lotus Light Dancers, where there's also a snakeskin texture on the curb. Unfortunately, we don't seem to have a clear depiction of the end of this railing anywhere, but I still think it's a really cool element. Another point about the palace, though. It's explicitly the same palace, Carsey Palace, as in the old Khans of Tarkir timeline. We know this palace already existed in the distant past of Fate Reforged, because there are cards in that set that reference it. And we know it was still in use through Dragons of Tarkir. So, how did an immense Angkorian structure, the real-world equivalent of which took half a century to complete, get replaced by this structure in under 2 years? Of course, the easy answer is it's magic, by which I mean both, it's just a game, and Wizards seems to play fast and loose with timelines, and to acknowledge that when you have literal magic to aid you with everything, you may be able to demolish and build complex structures much more quickly than those of us stranded in mundane reality. But I think there's a much more satisfying answer. As I mentioned before, this is a shot of the Cambodian royal palace. Which one is the palace, though? All of them are. In the same sense that Wat Phra Kaeo is a temple, but it has many structures within it, a palace can consist of many individual buildings. And even if these various towers are also part of Karsi Palace, once again, the artist is using a shaft of sunlight to direct our attention and tell us what's really important. And making this new palace structure reflect the way the houses of the people look feels like Kotis and the other new leaders of the Sultai saying to the larger community, this is your palace, not our palace. And that's absolutely reflected in Kotis's quote in the flavor text. Now, there's really just one other new card that puts architecture front and center, and that is the new art for the Life from the Loam reprint in the Dragonstorm Commander set. And of everything we've looked at in Dragonstorm, this is the only piece that really goes back and expands on the Angkorian influence of the original Sultai. And also, unlike everything else we've looked at in this set, it looks backward in time relative to Angkor Wat for its influence. About 300 years before Angkor Wat, in fact, Bekong was the first temple of its kind to be built in the city of Angkor. There are a number of other temples that could similarly stand in as a reference, but Bekong is among the best preserved. Now, I have to admit, I wish there was a bit more of the Angkorian influence present in Dragonstorm to tie things together with the original Tarkir block. Sage of the Fang and Ainok Wayfarer includes some square-edged structures in the background that at least fit in with the Angkorian style established in Khans, but that's really it. In the rest of the cards that depict Sultai towers, temples, palaces, they're all rounded, cylindrical, drawing from the fusion of styles that Leon Tucker established in his concept art. But, to be fair, we've already seen that Angkorian style. It got an entire block of 3 sets. Given that Wizards wanted to depict a truly new, changed incarnation of the Sultai, it's a fitting way to expand their style. And given that the classic Khmer or Angkorian style was the starting point, what we see here seems like a natural development from that style because that's what it is. And incorporating these other regional influences has the added benefit of expanding the range of people who get to see themselves, their culture, their heritage, represented in Magic. And that's clearly a good thing. Now, way back when we were looking at Sidisi in Khans of Tarkir, I made a big production about this shape. At that point, it had already shown up multiple times, starting with the very first image in the video. It showed up in the very next image we looked at, too. And it shows up again, and again, and again throughout all 3 sets of the original Tarkir block. But what is it? I already brought up the ancient Egypt possibility with the palm or fan axe. Beyond movies, we do see this shape frequently in ancient Egyptian art and hieroglyphs, representing either papyrus or lotus flowers. And the art from Tassiger the Golden Fang, the past leader of the Sultai from Fate Reforged, includes this shape on the back of his throne, with a texture that seems to imply that it might be a palm frond or some other kind of fan or leaf. But the shape is also reminiscent of a Naga head as expressed in Khmer sculpture, which itself is probably based on the silhouette of a hooded snake like a cobra. But things are further complicated by the fact this shape is used often, perhaps most often, in doorways and windows. And as an architectural feature, this would be considered a horseshoe arch, also known as a Moorish arch, which is thought to have originated in Persia and is primarily associated with the Middle East and the Mediterranean. It doesn't ever seem to have become a relevant architectural feature in Southeast Asia. Then, a little over a year ago, when Wizards brought Khans of Tarkir to Arena, some cards got new art, including Sidisi. Now, throughout the original Tarkir block, whenever a horseshoe arch was used, it was used consistently. A smooth curve at the top, then straight diagonal lines that lead to the main opening, presumably to match the snake or papyrus motif, whatever this is intended to be. But here, for the first time, we see keyhole arches, a subtype of horseshoe arch that feature most of a complete circle up top, but then flare back out beneath, rather than just going straight down. And every real-world example I can find of these is from the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. So I'm guessing that when Wizards hired artists for the new pieces that came with Khan's debut on Arena, they didn't give those artists all the same guidance and oversight as the artists who worked on the original block. And so, Zhejiao Chen, apologies for likely terribly mispronouncing that name, who did this piece, probably noticed the horseshoe arches scattered throughout the original block and decided to incorporate that theme, but didn't realize they were supposed to match this specific silhouette. But he did incorporate that motif in relief on the wall behind Sidisi, and up on the balcony. Whatever the original design intent was, what really grabs my attention is that this symbol, this shape, and horseshoe arches as a whole are completely absent from Tarkir Dragonstorm. And I really don't know why this happened, but my best guess is that Wizards' creative team realized, possibly due to their now working with cultural consultants whenever they do sets that reference real-world cultures, that however this visual element originated, it seems like an allusion to somewhere else, Egypt, the Mediterranean, and not Southeast Asia. I think it worked pretty well as a unifying element in the original block, and now that I've realized it's gone, I kind of miss it. But the Sultai of Dragonstorm have no lack of visual identity. Take Champion of Dusan. It's a green creature with green and purple clothing. Could be either Sultai or Abzan, but one look at those spires in the background removes all doubt. Well, thank you for indulging me on this journey through the history of the Sultai and their real-world influences. Let me know if you think I missed something notable or got something wrong. I'm not planning on doing this for any of the other clans, but if there's one you just absolutely love to hear about, I'll consider it. Just drop a note in the comments. Thanks, and see you next time.